If you've made it this far into the story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It's always wonderful to see how far these tales have traveled across the world. Share your city or country in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these historical romances, kindly subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story that time almost forgot.
In the year 1815, when England's cobblestones still echoed with the measured clatter of carriages and the air shimmered with the perfume of empire, the glittering world of the ton revolved upon a fragile axis of appearances. It was an age of delicate gloves and iron expectations, where a woman's value was tallied not by her mind, but by the promise of her marriage prospects. Beneath chandeliers that gleamed like captured stars, laughter and gossip drifted through the drawing rooms of Mayfair, thin, sweet sounds masking sharp tongues. And among those whom society had long condemned to silence was Lady Margaret Ashcombe, a woman of 40 who no longer danced, nor pretended to wish she did. Margaret's youth had once drawn polite curiosity, then faint amusement, and finally the sort of pity that stings more than mockery. Too clever, some had whispered; too proud, others claimed. The truth was simpler and more damning: she had opinions. While others had waltzed and fluttered beneath the approving eyes of dowagers, Margaret had spent her evenings with books smuggled from her late father's library, tracing the ink of Locke and Wollstonecraft with fingers that sought meaning beyond marriage settlements. Years had passed since her last London season, and she had retreated to Bath, that haven for the overlooked, where the gentle and the forgotten came to convalesce from the wounds of society. There, amid the stone crescents and rising mists, Margaret built a quiet, disciplined life. Each morning she walked along the pump-room terrace, nodding politely to those who still remembered her name, then returned to her modest home on Queen Square, where a fire burned low and her maid, Ruth, arranged correspondence and tea with military precision. To the outward eye, she was a lady of faded consequence, content, respectable, and utterly unremarkable. But within that calm exterior, her mind burned brightly. By candlelight she became someone else. Mr. A. Somerton, the anonymous author whose essays on the education and independence of women circulated through London's coffee-houses. Her words stirred argument in Parliament corridors and laughter in gentlemen's clubs, though few guessed the writer's true sex. The danger of exposure only deepened her resolve. She knew well that a woman's pen was more perilous than a man's sword. And yet, for all her courage in ink, Margaret lived with the quiet ache of isolation. Her friends were few, her evenings silent save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Sometimes, when the bells of Bath Abbey tolled, she would lift her gaze from her writing and wonder, had she been wrong to forego the path expected of her? The world beyond her study seemed to exist at a distance, as though behind glass. She loved it still, even as it mocked her. That same year, England greeted her returning sons from war. Napoleon had fallen, and with him, the shadow of invasion. The newspapers printed triumph, but beneath the ink lay the weariness of a nation that had lost too much. Among the celebrated heroes was one whose name appeared daily in the gossip columns: Henry Cavendish, the newly appointed Duke of Ravensshire. His title was ancient, his lineage unblemished, and his face, so the society painters declared, was fit for medals and marriage. The Duke, however, had little patience for such praise. At 38, he carried the invisible scars of Waterloo more keenly than the medals upon his chest. He had buried comrades and illusions alike on foreign soil and returned to a London that seemed trivial in comparison. Though the Ton welcomed him with adulation, he found its ballrooms hollow. Invitations from duchesses went unanswered. The sparkle of laughter grated like fine glass. His younger sister, the lively Lady Charlotte, urged him to rejoin society, but the Duke's replies grew shorter with each request. By autumn, weary of praise and pity alike, he accepted an invitation to Bath, intending to oversee a charitable fund for veterans' widows and wounded officers. He expected peace and paperwork, nothing more. It was during one of these charitable meetings, held in the echoing parlor of the pump-room, that Lady Margaret's name first crossed his awareness. He arrived late, rain darkening his coat and temper alike, to find a group of ladies debating the allocation of funds. At the head of the table, calm amid the chatter, sat a woman with graying hair neatly pinned, her expression composed, her pen scratching briskly across the minutes. Her eyes, a shade of storm gray, lifted briefly when he entered, not with admiration or curiosity, but with a measured politeness reserved for any stranger of consequence. "Your Grace," she said, rising just enough to acknowledge him. We were discussing the matter of housing for widowed seamstresses. Perhaps you have insight from your experiences abroad. The question, though courteous, carried an edge. The Duke studied her, noting the precision of her speech, the faint weariness in her eyes, the intelligence that gleamed there like tempered steel. He answered briefly, and the conversation resumed. Throughout the meeting, he observed how others deferred to her without quite realizing it. Her authority was subtle yet undeniable, her reasoning exacting. When at last the committee adjourned, Henry found himself strangely reluctant to leave. In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed again through the committee's work. Their exchanges were formal at first, brief discussions over reports and correspondence, but each encounter seemed to sharpen into a duel of ideas. She challenged him on matters of reform and charity with quiet fearlessness. He, unaccustomed to such candid opposition from any lady, found her conversation invigorating. There was no coyness in her. She spoke to him not as a duke but as a man capable of reason. He left their meetings unsettled, curious, and faintly amused by his own curiosity. Margaret, for her part, regarded the Duke with cautious respect. She knew the type, men whose charm masked condescension. Yet something in his manner defied that expectation. He listened when others interrupted, deferred when reason demanded it, and seemed almost embarrassed by his own importance. Once, when she mentioned a pamphlet she had read advocating schooling for orphan girls, he surprised her by quoting from it accurately. She looked up sharply, hiding her alarm. That pamphlet had been one of hers. He could not know, she told herself. The thought was dismissed almost at once, replaced by the familiar armor of composure. Still, his presence lingered in her thoughts after he left, as though the air itself carried his scent, rain, parchment, and distance. Winter settled over Bath, turning its streets to mirrors of frost. The Duke continued his charitable work, often at her side. Rumors began to stir among the city's smaller circles, whispers of their frequent collaboration. Margaret ignored them with practiced grace, though she felt the gaze of society tightening like a noose. He, however, seemed unaware or indifferent to it. On one occasion, when another committee member remarked slyly on their spirited friendship, Henry had simply smiled and replied, "A mind worth hearing is rarer than gold. I value it as such." The words reached Margaret later, carried by the same gossip that had long tormented her. She sat for a long time after hearing them, pen idle, tea gone cold. Something within her stirred, an emotion too dangerous to name. She rose, drew the curtains against the encroaching dusk, and whispered to the empty room, "Folly, Margaret, utter folly." Yet even as she spoke, her heart betrayed her with its quickened beat. Outside, the abbey bells tolled the hour, echoing over the silent city. The world beyond her window lay hushed, suspended between frost and promise. And though neither of them yet understood it, the quiet currents of their lives had begun to converge. Two weary souls, shaped by solitude and reason, moving unknowingly toward the kind of scandal that could unmake or redeem them both. The following spring arrived softened by rain and renewal, washing the streets of Bath in a mist that blurred the line between dream and recollection. The Duke of Ravensshire had now spent several months entangled in the city's charitable undertakings, and though he maintained the outward composure befitting his rank, he found his thoughts turning, with increasing frequency, toward Lady Margaret Ashcombe. Her intellect disarmed him, her restraint intrigued him. What had begun as a courteous partnership had grown into an unspoken study, each encounter revealing more of the other's hidden design. He, who had once faced cannon fire with steady nerve, now found himself unsettled by a single glance across a writing desk. Margaret, though aware of his attention, disciplined her mind against vanity. Attraction, she told herself, was a perilous indulgence for a woman of her years and reputation. Still, the Duke's presence tested her composure. He asked questions others avoided, listened as if her words held weight, and never once diminished her opinions to flatter his own. There was, in his gaze, neither pity nor conquest, only an earnest curiosity that disarmed her more thoroughly than charm could have. Their collaboration deepened as they planned a new school for the daughters of soldiers lost at Waterloo. The project required frequent correspondence, and their letters, intended for practicality, grew warmer, threaded with glimpses of personal thought. Margaret found herself smiling, against reason, at his dry wit and careful phrasing. His handwriting, firm and spare, betrayed the same discipline that marked his conversation. Each letter carried a sense of gravity, as though he weighed every word before letting it leave his hand. Yet beneath the civility of their exchanges ran an undercurrent neither dared name. When they met, her heart betrayed her composure with its quickened rhythm, and his voice, usually steady, softened when addressing her. The world around them continued its endless gossip, but within the quiet walls of Bath's committee rooms, they spoke a language ungoverned by rank or decorum, a language of thought, curiosity, and a growing tenderness neither wished to acknowledge. One evening, a storm rolled over the city. The committee had adjourned late, and Margaret lingered behind to gather her papers. A candle flickered near her hand, casting restless shadows across the parchment. She was unaware that the Duke had returned, having forgotten his gloves. When he entered, the gust of wind extinguished the light, plunging the room into half-darkness. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of rain against the window-panes. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I did not mean to intrude." "You seldom do, Your Grace," she replied, her tone polite yet edged with a nervous humor that masked her unease. He smiled faintly, stepping closer. "You work too late. Even Bath must sleep." "Bath has no mind to reform the world," she said, gathering her papers. "That burden falls to the restless few." He studied her in the dim light, struck by the calm defiance in her face. "You speak as if restlessness were a virtue." "Perhaps it is," she answered. "Without it, nothing changes." Her words hung between them, fragile and luminous. He wanted, absurdly, to tell her that her restlessness had already changed him, that in her company he had rediscovered something he thought war had extinguished, the quiet hope that life could be more than endurance. But the conventions of their world held him silent. Instead, he inclined his head and said only, "Then may your restlessness never fade." When he left, she stood alone, trembling with a confusion she refused to name. That night, unable to sleep, she lit another candle and turned to her writing. Her essay for the next edition of the Reformer's Review demanded revision, but her thoughts refused to align. Each sentence seemed haunted by his voice, each word a confession she could not make aloud. At last, frustrated, she pushed the paper aside and whispered into the silence, "This cannot be." In London, her essays had already stirred debate. Now, whispers reached Bath that the mysterious Mr. A. Somerton was a member of the city's reform circles. Margaret grew cautious, avoiding any remark that might betray her authorship. Yet fate, indifferent to discretion, conspired otherwise. During a routine review of the charity's accounts, the Duke discovered a letter among the documents, a draft written in Margaret's precise hand, its argument unmistakably identical to Somerton's most recent essay. He read the first lines once, then again, disbelief giving way to admiration. It was she. The realization struck him like light breaking through storm clouds. The woman society dismissed as a relic had been shaping discourse across the nation. Her intellect, which he had admired in conversation, now stood revealed as formidable genius. For several minutes he sat motionless, the letter open before him, torn between awe and concern. To expose her would destroy her reputation. To conceal the truth meant guarding a secret that might alter both their lives. When next they met, he said nothing at first. Instead, he watched her as one observes a rare work of art, fully aware of its worth and fragility. At last, during a walk along the Royal Crescent after a committee meeting, he spoke. "I once read an essay by a man who wrote with the conviction of a soldier and the insight of a philosopher," he began lightly. "Mr. A. Somerton, I believe." Margaret froze, her breath catching. "Yes," she said carefully. "I have read him as well. He writes of women's minds as though they were treasures long buried but not forgotten. It is an uncommon perspective." She turned to him then, eyes sharp, voice low. "And dangerous to hold, in certain circles." He smiled faintly. "Dangerous ideas have won greater battles than Waterloo." She said nothing more, but he saw in her gaze a flicker of recognition, an unspoken acknowledgment that he knew. Neither confessed it aloud. Neither needed to. The truth, now shared, bound them more intimately than words could. As spring ripened into summer, Bath buzzed with murmurs. The Duke's frequent presence at Lady Ashcombe's side drew scrutiny. Invitations grew pointed, then withdrawn. Yet he seemed immune to the whispers. At a charity gala, beneath chandeliers and curious stares, he crossed the ballroom to where Margaret stood alone. Without hesitation, he offered his hand. "May I have the honor, my lady?" The crowd hushed. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, aware of every gaze fixed upon them. Then, with quiet dignity, she placed her hand in his. The orchestra resumed, hesitant at first, then swelling into a waltz that seemed to defy propriety itself. They moved together, neither smiling nor speaking, yet the air around them pulsed with something unmistakable, the courage of two souls daring to meet as equals. When the music faded, he bowed, and she curtsied, their eyes locked in silent understanding. The gossip would erupt by morning. Reputations would tremble. But as they parted, a single truth anchored them both. Some revolutions begin not with proclamations, but with a dance. And though neither yet knew how the world would judge them, both sensed that the course of their lives had already, irrevocably, changed. The scandal broke as swiftly as summer thunder. By the week's end, every drawing-room from Bath to London hummed with speculation. That the Duke of Ravensshire, hero of Waterloo, guardian of ancient lineage, had danced with Lady Margaret Ashcombe, a woman 10 years his senior and twice dismissed by society, was enough to fill a dozen scandal sheets. Rumor exaggerated the scene into farce. Some claimed she had bewitched him with intellect, others that grief from the war had softened his reason. Invitations once freely offered to both were hastily rescinded. Yet while the Tun gorged itself on gossip, the subjects of its judgment continued their work with the same quiet resolve. Margaret refused to hide, though her composure came at great cost. She endured whispers in the assembly rooms, cold smiles from women she had once advised, and the pitying looks of men who found her boldness laughable. The Duke remained steady in public, but privately his anger simmered. He had faced enemy cannon without flinching. Now he was powerless against the invisible artillery of ridicule. His sister, Charlotte, arrived from London to warn him of the damage to his reputation, yet he met her anxious counsel with weary patience. "If my standing depends upon cowardice," he told her, "then it deserves to fall." Still, he knew the danger. For a man of his rank, affection was not a private indulgence. It was an inheritance, a matter of dynasty. The gossip might fade, but the memory of defiance would linger in the minds of Parliament and peers alike. Margaret, however, feared not for herself but for him. She had lived too long in the margins to mistake kindness for permanence. One evening, she received him at her home, where lamplight softened the severity of her study. He looked older, she thought, not from years, but from the weight of restraint. "You should not have come," she said, though her voice betrayed no conviction. "And yet here I am," he replied quietly. "You would have me silent while lies grow roots?" "Let them," she answered. "They will tire of us soon enough. You have a future they cannot forgive you for risking." He moved closer, his tone gentle. "You believe affection can be extinguished by opinion?" "I believe affection can ruin a man who still believes in honor," she said, lifting her gaze to his. "Do not make me the instrument of your undoing." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft hiss of the hearth. He reached into his coat and drew forth the folded pages of one of her essays, on the education of the unclaimed. Setting it upon the desk, he said, "You gave a voice to those the world refuses to hear. Allow me to do the same for you." She turned from him, trembling. "You cannot. You would destroy us both. I would rather stand ruined in truth than praised in falsehood." The conviction in his words pierced her defenses, awakening both pride and fear. She had fought for years to be invisible, to survive through secrecy. Now, the very man she admired threatened to tear down the walls that had kept her safe. Yet his sincerity was unassailable. When he left, she sank into her chair, the essay still lying between them like a confession. By the month's end, the murmurs in Bath had spread to London's newspapers. The Duke's name appeared beside veiled references to a certain lady of advanced intellect. Margaret could no longer attend meetings without feeling the weight of stares. Still, her resolve held. She continued her writing, though each word was written in a kind of defiance against the mockery surrounding her. One morning, as she reviewed proofs for her next essay, a letter arrived bearing the Duke's seal. Its contents were brief, a single page written in his clear, disciplined hand. "Tomorrow I speak in defense of the truth. If I fail, let history bear witness that I tried." Panic rose within her. She knew what such a declaration would mean. Exposure would cost him his seat, his influence, perhaps even his fortune. That night, she prayed, for his wisdom, for his restraint, though her heart thrilled with a forbidden pride that he would risk everything for her name. The following day dawned grey and heavy with rain. In London, at a gathering of reform advocates and peers, the Duke rose to speak. Margaret was not present, but by evening word of his address reached Bath in breathless fragments. He had praised the anonymous writer, Mr. A. Somerton, as the conscience of their generation, then declared, to the astonishment of all, that the essays were written not by a man but by a woman, he said, whose integrity and intellect surpassed the vanity of their entire age. His closing words were reported in every paper by morning. "Let the world mock if it must, but it will not silence what is right." Margaret read the transcript at dawn. Her hands shook as she traced the printed words. The revelation had indeed ignited outrage. Some called it madness, others moral corruption, but among younger reformers, his declaration inspired fervent support. Her secret, so long guarded, was no longer hers. Strangely, instead of fear, a profound calm settled over her. The mask she had worn for years had been lifted by another's courage, and though her world trembled, she felt, for the first time, seen. When he returned to Bath days later, she met him in her garden, where roses leaned heavy with rain. He removed his hat, eyes weary but resolute. "You should hate me," he said. She smiled faintly. "And yet I cannot. I had no right to speak for you." "You spoke truth," she said simply. "And truth is its own right." He reached for her hand, tentative, as though seeking permission. "Then allow me another. I love you, Margaret. Not for your defiance, though it humbles me, nor for your words, though they change the world, but for the peace I find in your presence. I ask for nothing but honesty between us." Her reply came softly, shaped by years of restraint and longing. "Then you shall have it. I love you, Henry Cavendish, recklessly, hopelessly, and against all sense." The confession released something within them both. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean into the warmth of another's certainty. They stood beneath the dripping branches as the storm eased, the world around them stilled into fragile silence. Their union, when it came, was quiet, no grand announcement, no glittering ceremony. Some circles refused to receive them, others admired them in secret. The Duke's influence waned in politics but deepened in moral authority. Together they founded the Ravensshire Trust, funding schools for orphan girls and wounded veterans' families. Margaret continued to write under her own name, her essays now bearing the quiet strength of a woman unafraid of her reflection. Years later, when time had softened their faces and dimmed the fervor of scandal, they often walked the same garden paths, hands entwined, speaking not of the past but of the future they had once dared to imagine. The world had not entirely forgiven them, but neither had it forgotten. History, indifferent yet enduring, would remember the Duke who defied convention and the woman who taught him that intellect and love need not stand opposed. As the sun set over Bath's honey-colored stone, Margaret would sometimes pause to listen to the distant bells of the abbey. Their sound carried through the air, mournful, resolute, eternal. She would smile and whisper, "It was worth the scandal." And beside her, Henry would take her hand, his voice low with affection. "Yes, my love," he would say. "Every whisper was worth the truth."